Thank you for this opportunity to let me share some of my research with you. I'm looking forward to the discussion and the feedback. The title of my talk is The Centrality of Noble Goods, Bona Honesta for Human Flourishing. And this is a sketch of a part within a larger project of trying to elaborate a developmental phronetic account of the natural law. I used to think that Aquinas' notion of Bona Honesta, which I'll often be referring to as noble goods, was obscure and rather incidental to his overall moral theorizing. But I've come to think that it actually needs to play a central role in our understanding of human flourishing, virtues, and the natural law. And so what I want to share here are some preliminary ways in which I've been trying to set out philosophical criteria for discerning and defending Bona Honesta, or noble goods, and especially their relationship to human flourishing. So two questions that are going to be central here are, what are the criteria for noble goods? How are they related to natural inclinations, practices, relationships, virtues? And what's the relationship between noble intrinsic goods and human flourishing, or eudaimonia? I think that these concepts, noble goods, virtues, natural law, are interrelated and mutually presupposing each other with respect to how we define flourishing. So if we think of flourishing here, there's a tight categorical circle that unites flourishing, honesta, virtues, and law. Flourishing is the overall governing end of human lives. Honesta, these noble goods, they through practical wisdom, we order these, and they're goods in themselves of a developing life. They come to constitute what flourishing is. And the natural law sets the general domains and precepts concerning what is good or bad for human flourishing. And virtue involves the interpretive, normative dispositions we acquire and cultivate that are required to discern, pursue, and enjoy noble goods of flourishing as they're commanded by the natural law. And it's important that we see these as interconnected, flourishing, honesta, virtues, law, because we get a very different picture of these different moral categories if we define virtues, say, apart from rules or natural law, or if we define law apart from virtue, or if you define either law or virtue apart from eudaimonism, or independent of these bona honesta, as I think that too many accounts do. So we need a clear account of not just rules of the natural law and flourishing and virtue. We also need a clear account of what exactly are bona honesta and how do they interrelate to these other concepts. There's two kind of background presumptions that I need to speak to a little bit in order to get into the details of this particular account. So these are just things I want to talk about that frame the overall project and set up the place or the role of these bona honesta or noble goods. So first is about conceiving of the natural law and human flourishing, eudaimonia, in terms of a developmental account. That human flourishing shouldn't be defined as a sort of elite achievement of individuals engaged in contemplative activity alone at a certain mature and healthy state of life, but rather we should think of human flourishing ontogenetically, and that there are distinct ways in which we flourish at distinct ages in our lives. Second is that we need to recognize especially the role of the virtues, in particular prudence, phronesis, practical wisdom, and how it is crucial for the discernment of the natural law. And I take this particular approach to make it somewhat distinct approach to the natural law from, say, classical natural law or new natural law approaches. So I want to briefly clarify these two background features before turning to a sketch of noble goods and their place with respect to flourishing, virtues, and the natural law. So I'm not going to get into the arguments here, but we need to set out a developmental account of flourishing. And by developmental, I don't just mean how do we, at a mature state in life, cultivate, say, the virtues, although that's important too, but rather that we need to be thinking about humans overall throughout their life or in a ontogenetic developmental process phases and virtue of being dependent and rational animals. And this human development needs to be understood with respect to the ways in which we develop physiologically, psychologically, personally, socially, and even with respect to our existential worldview. And by existential worldview, I mean two things. First, an existential worldview is kind of like a folk or common ontology. It concerns what we think exists in the world, what's ready at hand, what's available. And this is something that changes and develops historically. So we might think there are things in the world like humans and other animals that have evolved. We might think that there are smartphones, that there's Bitcoin, that there are international treaties, that there are wars and conflicts. And these are the sorts of things that we think and learn and discover exist in our world and influence the way we and others inhabit that world. But also by existential worldview, I mean something concerning the way we think about the point and purpose or meaning, significance of living and dying, and what the overall point of that living and dying is. And so these two senses of existential existing within a world are intertwined. Now, I refer to this whole collection of factors, capacities, and functions and activities of humans pertaining to our ontology, physiology, psychology, personal capacities for reasoning, willing, and narrative identity, social interactions, and existential worldview as just the human panoply. And we need to think about the way in which we don't just have a directedness or finality with respect to physiology independent of psychology, that the finality of our physiology is bound up with the psychology, and that you're not going to get very far in early child development in terms of the development of one's physiology and psychology apart from social interactions. And this continues on throughout life, that we don't develop personally or psychologically, physiologically. We don't stay healthy apart from social interactions. And so it's important to understand these factors not in isolation, but in a kind of transformative rationality account, the way in which rationality shapes the integration of the finalities of these together with respect to a whole human life, and also how they are developmentally indexed. Different phases of human life is going to have a different priority or way in which these are coordinated when we are toddlers, adolescents, young adults, older adults, adults reaching their senescence. Another feature about this account then of human flourishing is there's a debate about eudaimonia in Aristotle and in other Aristotelian thinkers, and I'm not going to engage in that debate, but there's a distinction between whether or not flourishing or eudaimonia is uniform or multiform. Is it a single thing that the flourishing consists in, like, say, contemplation? Or should we think of eudaimonia, flourishing, as multiform and constituted by many goods? And that's the particular take that I have on this. So flourishing consists in the life of a developing, dependent, rational animal, lived in pursuit of activities and the enjoyment of common and individual noble goods in accordance with virtues and natural law. And importantly, flourishing is inflected differently at different phases of human development. So we need to understand what flourishing looks like at any phase of human development in a way that rationally transforms and orders this ontogeny of our physiology, psychology, personal, social, and existential worldview factors in ways that both integrates at a particular phase, and as that phase is understood with respect to other phases. So there are going to be, distinct markers characteristic of what it is physiologically, psychologically, personally, and socially for an individual in some historical context to be flourishing at some particular phase of development. There's a distinctive kind of flourishing of these markers or factors proper to adolescence and proper to the senescent. And we can't just understand that phase on its own. We need to understand it in relationship to a whole human life. So these markers, or for phases of development, need to be also understood as developing as arising from prior phases and directed toward subsequent phases developments. So adolescents cannot be flourishing if they're only excelling at being adolescents. They can't be failing in maturing into an adult who's no longer an adolescent. There needs to be partially defined adolescent flourishing as developing into the next phase beyond adolescence. So those are just some of the quick pointers that I haven't given any arguments for, but sort of background conditions of how I'm thinking about the natural law and human flourishing or eudaimonia with respect to development. We need to think then about these noble goods and virtues and rules that are required to discern and attain noble goods, how these are developmentally inflected with respect to these different ages and these different factors of the panoply. And when we present the noble goods, my examples are probably just going to focus on one or other of these phases of human life, but they would need to be complexified, and so we can consider how they show up in these different phases in human life. All right, so the second thing I need to briefly mention in the background condition is what this phronetic developmental account of natural law is, and why it's neither classical natural law nor new natural law approach, or at least not as I understand the classical natural law. Someone might argue that this just is another version of classical natural law, and that might be a fair way of putting it, but I'm at least distinguishing it from some of the more well-known versions. So just some brief points to distinguish it from these other two. So classical natural law often argues that we transition from non-practical facts about human goods, about the way these goods, as speculative or theoretical reason shows, these goods fulfill human powers and inclinations, and we then make some arguments and transitions to how to conceive of these goods as practical goods of humans, and as practical goods then that motivate practical reason and our voluntary actions. So it argues that we can move from facts that seem to be facts about human goods that are known theoretically to practical knowledge of norms or values. And there's this transition from theoretical reasoning about our goods to practical reasoning about our goods. New natural law, on the other hand, argues that we need to commence, and that we do commence instead, from a priori intuitions into incommensurable, basic goods of practical reason, and that facts about human flourishing only become practically charged and relevant insofar as they can be subsumed under these independently grasped by practical reason basic goods. So these basic goods aren't derived from theoretical reason, but things we learn, facts, theorizing, features from speculative knowledge can come to be subsumed under already grasped basic goods of practical reason. And then finally, the approach that I want to take, which I don't have a good label for it, as you can see, so sometimes refer to it as a practical wisdom approach to the natural law, or phronetic natural law. It's a developmental approach, but it points out, following McIntyre, that actually our lives commence with a complicated set of endoxa, of received reputable opinions that are comprised of natural functional or thick concepts, as they're called in a lot of metaethical discourse. These are irreducible normative facts concerning what fulfills our human panoply. So we start with this complex endoxa from the culture around us, of a set of claims about what are the rules, or what are the virtues, or what are the goods, or what is happiness, or what is well-being, or what is flourishing, what should our desires be, what's a happy life, what's a successful life look like. Different cultures are going to have more or less uniform conceptions of this that are handed down. There might be some conflicts between parents and grandparents and family members, or teachers, or siblings, or one's peers or friends and neighbors that give you conflicting accounts that you have to negotiate. But we start with these, and these are, importantly, not just pure facts, nor are they pure values, but they're thick concepts. They're natural functional concepts. And because they are thick concepts that are known first in a kind of practical way, but as thick concepts built in as irreducible facts, they're always open to theoretical inquiry into our nature, our panoply, which might lead us to revise some of these purported normative facts. So it sort of has elements like new natural law, that we actually do start off with a more rich, practical, existential worldview approach to these goods, but unlike them, it rejects the idea that they're just pure values or pure norms. They're thick concepts, and so, like in classical natural law, they're open to revision and further evaluation, even in their normative features, by virtue of coming to understand deeper facts or deeper truths about them that might make us revise or improve them. So it's out of this moral endoxa that we inherit culturally, historically uniform or diverse accounts of happiness, flourishing, goods and bads, virtues and vices, and catalogs of them, meaningful accounts of what is a meaningful life or success, rules and customs. And we have to ask at a certain stage in our life and our development, not just at certain stages, but continuously, which of these norms that we've inherited really conform to the natural law. And this often shows up in questions of just, why should I do that? Why should I think that that's what's good? And it's through reflection on these or through conflict in saying, well, is this the good or is this the good? Which of these inherited conceptions actually distort my life and don't lead to my flourishing or the flourishing of others? And it's in asking these why questions and trying to reflect on what's the place of these goods? How should I prioritize these goods of family or career or taking care of children or various activities of leisure? How do they fit within a life? How do I coordinate? Here's one conception of how I should coordinate them in life and how I should prioritize them. And in asking these questions, we're really aspiring to practical wisdom. And it's this aspiration of practical wisdom that's embodied in this reflective questions and inquiries concerning these practices and their theoretical justifications. Can we vindicate this inheritance, or do we need to reinterpret it or revise it? And this is how we discern the natural law in our lives. All right, so now we can turn to the proper topic at hand, thinking through some criteria for identifying noble goods and clarifying a little bit further, what's the place of these noble goods with respect to concepts of our natural inclinations and the natural law, our practices, relationships, virtues, and in particular, what's the relationship of these noble or intrinsic goods, these Bona Honesta, and human flourishing or eudaimonia? So first, a noble good, bonum honestum, it's a good in itself. In itself, it furnishes a good reason for its pursuit because it's perfective of the human panoply. That is, it fulfills our human functions, our capabilities, our powers for acting in a human way, of seeking and achieving flourishing. These noble goods, as Aquinas and others have identified, are neither instrumental goods, things that we do simply for the sake of pursuing something else, nor are they merely pleasant goods. Noble goods, when we have the virtues and have transformed our capacities for enjoyment, are things we enjoy often, but they aren't pursued because they're enjoyed. Enjoyment is something that when we have the right perceptions, responses, emotions, and desires transformed by the virtues, we will enjoy these goods when they're goods to be enjoyed and enjoyed in the right kind of way, but that's not why we pursue them. The pleasure is a resultant, supervenient feature, not the end itself. These noble goods need to be contrasted from base bads. Base bads are privations of flourishing in themselves. They are impediments, obstacles, corruptions, distractions from flourishing in themselves. And base bads often involve deliberate wrongdoing, vice, and malice. There's a whole range of things that count as types of noble goods, and I'm going to get into more detail, but we might say things like health, reaching sexual maturity, reproducing, childcare, appropriate psychological attachments and emotional development, personal maturity, self-knowledge and interiority of an interior life, initiation into forms of relationships, whether they be family, friendships, neighbors, with colleagues, initiation of types of social interactions, various political and the pursuit of various common goods, and education into kinds or traditions of inquiry, wonder, ethics, skills and practices, leisure, culture and arts, exploration, whether it be nature or travel, sports, contemplation, knowledge, liturgy and worship. All of these are cases or kinds of noble goods when done in the right sort of way. Second, So that's just sort of a basic framework. Second, what are some of the semantic resonances of these Bona Honesta? So the historical connection is often to Aristotle and Plato's accounts of the to kalon, their treatment of the noble or the fine, a very difficult Greek term to translate. You might think of it as what's the honest or the honorable, what's respectable, refined, dignified, decent or worthy. So what could be considered as worthwhile or admirable, kinds of moral uprightness. They're types of, using Charles Taylor's language, maybe strong or higher goods. They can be that which is sacred or sacrosanct. I'm not so sure if we should connect the language of Bona Honesta with some of these, what I at least have real or maybe just pragmatic worries with terms that are normatively vectorless, like strong evaluations or values or meaningfulness or right. So contrasting from those insofar as they're taken to be in non-directed, non-teleological. This is deeply meant to be a teleological concept. Third, let's get into the issue now of noble goods and their relationship to flourishing. So here, following Aquinas and his treatment of honestum from the Secunda the Summa Theologia, flourishing, what Aquinas will refer to as beatitude, it characterizes the whole form of life, the whole of a human life, even if we want to think of it developmentally phased. So flourishing, it pertains to sort of the exigent completeness of a human life, whatever is going to make a human life complete and perfective, and not lacking essential constitutives. Here we might further elaborate flourishing and distinguish this sort of very earthly wayfarer pilgrim conception of flourishing in this life and distinguish it from beatitude, something that might require grace and supernatural perfection of our lives. We might distinguish it from thriving, what can be achieved by those who are unfortunately radically disabled. Thriving is not the same as flourishing. Flourishing involves one's own psychological directedness in the achievement of goods, whereas thriving might be something achieved through one's caregivers, but one makes very little of their own psychological input into the setting of the directionality of one's life. We might also think of heroic flourishing, more along Stoic lines, who defend the sufficiency thesis that virtue of itself alone is sufficient for flourishing, which would actually place these noble goods as things that are to be valued but are not essential to flourishing. So this, given this Aristotelian conception, they are taken to be integral to flourishing. In contrast to flourishing, noble goods are inherently incomplete, but many noble goods, when rightly ordered, they partially constitute and are indispensable goods of flourishing in this life. So Bona Honesta are related to the definition of flourishing. Flourishing is the completeness of a human life with respect to different phases in an overall human life, and a completeness that's constituted by the achievement and pursuit of these noble goods, whereas the noble goods are inherently incomplete, and they are going to, through the proper coordination and pursuit, not just as noble goods, but as properly ordered in a human life, going to partially constitute flourishing. So it's important to recognize that it will always be an error to identify one's flourishing with any particular noble good. A noble good can only ever be partial and incomplete. It can't be the whole of one's flourishing. And here again, just to mention a few noteworthy noble goods. Noble goods include various common goods. They include the virtues. They can include supererogatory activities. But they also importantly involve certain kinds of relationships or practices. Those relationships and practices that have intrinsic goods that specify their internal standards of excellence. The standards of excellence required for achieving these intrinsic goods. So relationships and practices like medicine or engineering, of theology or philosophy, of literature or history, of craftsmanship, of cabinetry. These are all types of practices that can partially be noble goods that partially constitute the flourishing of a human life, and relationships, that of parents to child, child to parents, relationships to grandparents, siblings, friendships, colleagues, neighbors. These are all noble goods. All right, fourth, noble goods and natural inclinations. Noble goods, how do we identify them? Well, they have to truly fulfill our norm-governed and rationally integrated and transformed panoply, that interconnection of the directionality of our physiology, psychology, personal, social, and existential capacities and functions as developing independent rational animals. So these inclinations, what Aquinas called inclinationes, they need to be understood as rationally transformative, as not having reason outside of them, but the very function itself of the identification of purposes or ends, the very finality, and what we need to do to achieve that end, characterizes each of these noble goods and their relationship to these different factors in the panoply. We can't just understand the psychological or the physiological on their own. We need to understand them as integrated. And this brings us to an idea of a conception of eudaimenistic needs for flourishing. What are the capacities that we need to fulfill in order to flourish? And here I want to identify 8 or so noble good domains that are exigent for fulfilling our natural inclinations. And for each one of these, it needs to be normatively balanced, so preference each one with that which is good or just or dignified. So first, health. Second, standard of living. Third, various affiliations. Fourth, education. Fifth, work. 6, leisure. 7, political community. 8, virtues and one's existential worldview. So I'm going to go through each of these in a little bit more detail. This list itself is partially derived from what's set out by MacIntyre in Ethics and the Conflicts of Modernity. You might find many similar lists, and some of it's taken from modifications of Martha Nussbaum's treatment of human capabilities. For an interesting treatment and critique of that, I'd recommend Jean Porter's Nature as Reason, but there's also been discussed by many others. And for a discussion and analysis of many different lists, see the interesting but somewhat uneven book Christian Smith, To Flourish, Destruct, who puts together something like 20, somewhere around 15 or 20 of different accounts of similar lists to this one. One of the important points that MacIntyre makes about this conception, these aren't just like kind of basic needs for human survival. These are needs for flourishing. So that's why I'm calling them eudaimenistic needs. Needs to have these and these capacities within our panoply fulfilled. And each of them are going to integrate physiology, psychology, personal, social, and existential factors. They're not going to be just, health isn't going to be thought just of as physiology, and affiliation shouldn't be thought of just as the social factor. They need to incorporate all of them together with different valence priorities within the panoply. One important point that MacIntyre makes about these eudaimenistic needs, as I've called them, is that people can still flourish without one or more of them. And as the case of the heroic flourishing as characterized by the Stoic, they can be deprived of quite a few of them. But then it's going to be crucial for even those persons to think through the importance of reestablishing them and how to overcome the injustices or tragic events that brought about their deprivation. As he points out in Ethics and the Conflicts of Modernity, quote, "Many excellent lives are so, despite the absence from them of one or more of these. But the more of them that are absent, the more resourceful an agent will have to be in coping with the difficulties that their absence causes. Such resourcefulness includes an ability to recognize what would have to be changed and what could be changed either in her or himself in the social and institutional order that the agent inhabits in order to achieve and enjoy the goods constitutive of the good life." End quote. So with respect to these 8 or so these are going to be thought of here, these eudaimonistic needs, as the broad domains, the capabilities that we have to fulfill in order to achieve flourishing. These are these constitutive goods of human flourishing, and each of these 8 is going to show up differently in the different developmental phases of our lives, and so the exigency for them will be different. For instance, participation in a political community will be very different for small children than it will be for older adults. What the natural law precepts command is the pursuit of these eudaimonistic needs, and condemns the ignoble or base acts that prevent or undermine these eudaimonistic needed noble goods. So just to go into each of them a little bit more, by health, I broadly want to include the ways in which life and physiological and psychological health and bodily integrity are essential goods for our flourishing. They partially constitute it. These are goods in themselves that are worthwhile to be sought in themselves. That no further reason for seeking them other than just to have them is required. Next, a just and dignified standard of living, where potable water, food, clothing, and shelter, without which we would be reduced to destitution and would be incapable of pursuing these other kinds of goods. It's worth having these for their own sake, but they are the kind of basic goods of survival. But more than that, we need them in order to flourish, in order to pursue these other ends as well. Affiliations. Good affiliations, just and dignified affiliations, obviously include the relationships of family, friends, colleagues, neighbors, and a community, and rich forms of these that overlap and intersect in important ways. For education, what I mean is an education that makes each of us truly human, and this will be very historically, socially, culturally diversified. It involves the transformation and the maturation of our abilities to perceive the world, to imagine possibilities for ourselves and others, to engage in achieve literacy, to have imaginative wonder about the world, about ourselves, about our relationships, to grow and develop in reasoning, both practical and theoretical reasoning, to attain kinds of knowledge, skills in mathematics, in history, in literature, in narrative, in storytelling, to engage and learn how to participate as a practical reasoner in political reasoning, so to become not just social animal, but a political animal, and as well as to cultivate, and to some extent, one's aesthetic abilities, one's capacities for enjoying beauty of the natural world and of art of various kinds. Fifth I mentioned was work. So in addition to this fourth account of attaining a kind of humane education, however that is understood rightly in different cultural historical contexts, we're also going to need to have an education that prepares us for work. And work can be of many kinds, but it involves productive contributions of goods, but it needs to be able to be dignified and rewarding work. In addition to work, I identified leisure, and leisure is understood here very broadly. It includes the practices and activities of religion, of aesthetics, of athletics, of sport, and of varieties of pleasures, things that are now called various types of artisan breads, fancy coffee, wine. These are all important aspects of human leisure that are goods in themselves. There's also then important goods, noble goods pertaining to political community, and this involves not just political participation, but kinds of civic friendships, the importance of peace, justice, and rule of law that is enjoyed as common goods by all. And then finally, eighth, I mentioned virtues and existential worldview. For each of us, there will be the good of the inherited and passed on shared tradition of informed rational reflection and often cooperative reasoning and control and the virtuous ordering of the overall directionality of our shared lives and one's own life. So a lot more could be said about each of these. I think that there's good evidence empirically to show that they have wide-ranging basis in ethnographic and anthropological studies, and we can develop more metaphysical accounts of the ways in which they are the fulfillments of various powers, the powers that make up what I call the panoply, the powers that make up the integrated finality of our physiology, psychology, personal, social, and existential worldview factors. I want to turn now to the way in which, as our lives develop, some of these noble goods, which will all be more culturally differentiated and specified, how some of them come to become what I will label settled and vocational noble goods. As our lives develop, certain noble goods, relationships, practices, individual and common goods, become settled. And even some of them become what I will call vocational goods. And thereby they become central constitutives of one's life and one's flourishing. So first, vocational noble goods. Vocational noble goods are central and they are permanent to the directionality of one's life. We might spend a great deal of time agonizing and sussing out and discerning what are these vocational noble goods. The list of what could be and what do become vocational noble goods in one's life is going to be a very small list. And one of the defining features of them, although this is something that in the past I've gotten pushback on, so I'd be interested in hearing some debate and reflection from others on this, but one of the features that defines them and distinguishes them from settled noble goods is that you can't give them up, even by performing base actions or through tragic events. So parents will always be parents of their children, even if they lost their children tragically or had to give them up or lost them through their own base actions, perhaps abusing the child, abusing their spouse, such that their spouse takes the children away from this particular person and they no longer have the children actively in their lives. It nevertheless will be a permanent defining feature of the directionality and overall story of that person's life. In addition to parents and siblings and spouses, or perhaps religious life, vocational goods might also involve one's commitment to the virtues, one's relationship and directing of one's life towards God, or alternative religious ways of understanding one's life that can never really be given up. They might also characterize types of elite, political, military, similar offices, or elite, excellent forms of athletics, performance, and even one perhaps gives up those offices or gives up those performances or those kinds of athletic activities, there might still be the legacy that carries on throughout defining that person's life. More common are then settled noble goods. These are central to the directionality of one's life and flourishing, but they're not necessarily permanent. They might be permanent or more or less permanent, but they need not be. So someone can give them up, and there are at least three ways in which we can give up these settled noble goods. So they become settled within our lives as they might just start off being a noble good that we partake in. Someone becomes excellent at cooking. Someone becomes a philosophy professor. Someone takes on a political office. Someone opens a restaurant. But there might be things or reasons or justifications for why they're given up. Now, they might be given up either through base actions or through tragic events. One might have had a very successful bakery, and then due to COVID and lockdowns, tragic events led to it such that this settled noble good in their life, something they maybe be committed to for 10, 15 years, was no longer capable of sustaining itself, and due to tragic events, they lost it. It might be because someone's pursuing some other settled vocational noble good, settled or vocational noble good. So one might be engaged in doctoral studies, but due to one's commitments to family. Perhaps a child becomes ill, perhaps a parent becomes ill, perhaps there's a very important opportunity for one's spouse and their own settled noble goods. And so one has to give up their doctoral studies in order to fulfill or sustain these other noble goods relating to other family members or other kinds of pursuits. So there might be, good reasons for giving up noble goods that are settled in one's life. There might be other settled vocational noble goods of others. And a third way in which we might have to give up or do give up settled noble goods is simply by developing out of them. So, the kind of noble goods that are settled of sibling life that's shared in a household will be given up when one no longer is a sibling living in that shared household, when one goes out into the world and takes on and starts their own life. There might also be, especially for adolescents and young adults, settled noble goods of academic pursuits or music or athletic. And so at a certain stage in their life, they become very dedicated to athletic pursuits as adolescents and maybe as young adults, maybe even all the way into college, whether it be academic, like I said, or music or athletic. But at a certain stage, academic pursuits is something that they graduate out of. And that's a perfectly good reason for them to give up and transition out of these settled noble goods. All right, so that's the brief on settled and vocational noble goods. Now I want to move on to the way in which these noble goods are related to virtues and rules. So as with flourishing and its central constitutives, these noble goods involve characteristic rules and virtues, as well as inherited traditions that give us existential worldviews that have narratives about exemplary lives, exemplary stories of lives, exemplary ways of flourishing or squandering even noble goods by vice or virtue. These noble goods can't be rightly sought, achieved, and sustained apart from the aspiration to follow these rules and exhibit these virtues. Virtues would actually teach us how to interpret these rules and apply them. So this is now zooming in a little bit more on the criteria for noble goods and the ways in which the virtues and the natural law can help us discern what are and what are not noble goods. The panoply supplies us with a fairly, wide, open-ended set of apparent goods, and what the noble goods specifies and restrict are these capacities of our panoply to what is the true natural inclination, the true normative finality of these natural inclinations that are specified within the boundaries of the natural law, the things commanded and prohibited from the natural law, and with respect to the dynamic mean that's sussed out, determined by the virtues application and interpretation and, enabling of us to pursue these goods in the here and now. There are also then going to be the ignoble or base actions, which are inherently wrong, and they always mar, thwart, or undermine the realization of certain noble goods. These base actions mar our forms of common and individual human flourishing by preventing us from pursuing these partial constitutives of human flourishing. All right, to go a little bit deeper, I'm going to start first with the precepts of the natural law and how they pertain to these noble goods in particular as eudaimonistic needs, and then move on to the virtues, which are the inactive, interpretive living out and elaboration of the natural law. I'm not going to say too much here about these precepts, other than they'll be just very general positive and negative ones. The positive precepts will be things like promote health, promote just and dignified standard of living, pursue good affiliations of family, friends, and colleagues, neighbors, enable and pursue a truly humane education, seek dignified work, enable the possibility for dignified work. If you are an employer, provide dignified work for others. and so on. And prohibitions will be similarly straightforward. Don't thwart health, oneself or one's other thwart. And because a natural law is an ordinance of reason directed to the common good, they will not just concern individuals, but we need to understand these positive and negative precepts as pertaining generally, not just to ourselves, but to others. So do not undermine standards of living. Do not corrupt education, not just for oneself, but for others. Do not support, establish, or enable undignified working conditions. Do not work so as to exclude all leisure. Do not undermine types of political participation in political community that are just. Do not act contrary to the rule of law. Importantly, we can say that all these noble goods, like common goods, which are important cases of noble goods, we can never unjustly exclude either other true individual or common goods. So to be a noble good is something that doesn't unjustly exclude other true individual or common goods, or they don't unjustly exclude other persons from participating in these noble goods. So that's ways in which not just the features of the natural law of pursue and avoid, but importantly, how do we think about these noble goods with respect to other noble goods? And one of the criteria for identifying something that's genuinely a noble good and can genuinely find its place as a noble good in one's life is it cannot be pursued as a noble good in a way, and it would undermine it as a noble good if you pursued it in a way that excluded others from enjoying true individual common goods, maybe different ones, or excluded other persons from participating in these noble goods. So these prohibitions are, further codifications of these negative natural law precepts. And what would make them unjust? Well, they're going to be unjust because of some conception of justice as desert. So they'll be unjust because somehow they're undeserved. And they're going to be undeserved because they're contrary to, for instance, these eudaimonistic needs. They somehow undermine one's or others' pursuit of some eudaimonistic need. Obviously, a lot more would need to be said here. Another way in which we need to think about them, and this is perhaps more in a positive natural law precept way rather than the negative one that I just characterized, is the ways in which noble goods oblige. Noblesse oblige, all relatively independent human persons, but they oblige us all in different ways. So if they have a genuine noble good, they're going to oblige everyone, but they will oblige us in different ways. And these, as I noted, are going to be codified generally by positive precepts of the natural law. What are some of the ways that noble goods oblige every person? Well, they might first oblige someone because they are a settled or even a vocational noble good for them. So they're going to be central to the directionality of their life. They might also oblige you because they are central noble goods. They're settled or vocational noble goods, central to the directionality of other people's lives, especially those other people who are for you vocational noble goods. So the life of my child is a vocational noble good of my own, that I care for the good of my child. And so some pursuits that are noble or vocational noble goods of my own child will thereby be things that I have a very special obligation towards. And third, in a more general way, things simply in virtue of being noble goods for others, even if they aren't even settled or vocational noble goods for those others, they're nevertheless things that we are obliged to enable, encourage, admire, or sustain or contribute in some ways. I might not be a baker, I might not have a bakery, I might not have anyone close in my family, but perhaps one of my neighbors is a baker. And this might be a place that I should go out of my way to frequent their shop, to support them and encourage them. I might have a colleague who works on Reformation history. This might be a topic of not directly related to my own research, but it's important that there are people and they do good work and they contribute to the common good by producing research, monographs on these topics. And it's the sort of way in which I'm obliged to, admire, participate in celebratory events when these books are released, encourage others in the reading of them, have conversations with others about them, even if it doesn't become a central part of my research. So there are a lot of ways in which we can admire or sustain or contribute to, but have at least some minimal obligation towards these. These are what I would want to classify as obligations in a very broad sense, not like absolute duties, but more like virtuous obligations. And our virtuous dispositions, they exhibit within us a kind of obliging, responsible responsiveness to these noble goods. Noble goods are attractive by an internal normative gravity. They're good in themselves. And this connects into our virtuous dispositions and our aspirations to flourish, to be excellent. So they oblige in this way. When Robert Sokolowski talks about the ways in which they oblige, he says it's the thing to do. There's a quote from Sokolowski in his treatment of the natural law. It's the thing to do, the thing to be done, the thing that is worthy of us and makes us honorable as human agents. This is a really broad, important sense of obligation that is a little wider, more flexible and defeasible than sort of conceptions of absolute duty. McDowell has kind of a similar line in the way he thinks of the imperatives of the virtues, which silence other reasons. They make these the pertinent good reasons, and other good reasons are silenced. And it's not so much that they're overridden, it's that they aren't recognized as good reasons here and now. So there's a kind of broad sense here. There's obviously a lot more that needs to be developed on this line, but I'm going to move on. Finally, an important point here is that virtue itself is a noble good. Virtue is an end in itself. It's something that's worth pursuing for its own sake. It's, of course, contributes to and enables the possibility for us to follow the rules of the natural law. It enables us to pursue and achieve and enjoy in the right kind of way, with the right kind of people, these noble goods, to suss them out and discern them, to coordinate them in our overall life. But that very capacity itself, that transformation of us that makes us into one who achieves noble goods, is itself a noble good. Our developmental flourishing is constituted. Like, how do we flourish as humans throughout the developmental phases of our life, of discerning what does flourishing look like as an adolescent, as a young adult, as someone who's getting older, as someone who's entering their senescence. It's going to require an ongoing harmonization and finding complementary coordination of these noble goods within one's life and the lives of one's settled and vocational relationships. And it's the virtues that allow and enable someone to become the kind of person who can phronetically, dynamically continue to find this mean and so to organize one's life. It's through our phronetic or practical wisdomed transformation and coordination of our dispositions. And this is required to pursue and achieve these distinct noble goods, different noble goods of practices, noble goods in relationships of different kinds. And we need these virtues, especially practical wisdom, to interpret and apply the precepts of the natural law here and now. There's no rules for applying and selecting which rule to use and when to use and how to apply it and what is its relevance here and now. That's through the virtues. And furthermore, we need the virtues to harmonize and coordinate noble goods within the overall directionality of the story of one's life. So it's not going to be possible for us to achieve flourishing, to achieve these noble goods that partially constitute our flourishing, apart from the virtues. But to just become that kind of person that has so harmonized themselves, has transformed their powers, so their responsiveness, their appetites, their desires have been transformed to conform to practical wisdom in the pursuit of these noble goods. Many of these noble goods, like relationships and practices, require that we transform our perceptions, our desires, so that we can be successful in a relationship, so that we can achieve the internal goods of them. If we don't learn how to communicate, how to share, how to sacrifice, how to support each other, how to develop healthy forms of psychological attachment, healthy forms of affection within our relationships of spouses, of children, are going to harm these relationships. And it's this transformation in ourselves that allows us to fulfill and succeed in these different kinds of noble goods like relationships or practices. And finally, I want to talk about the way in which this type of phronetic harmonization occurs and a type of ways in which we rank order our obligations among various noble goods. So I think phronesis, prudence, provides us with the capacity for discerning how to rank order our obligations among noble goods. They're going to discern a mean or a middle, a center, that helps us coordinate our vocational and settled noble goods without crowding out others and neglecting some vocational or settled noble good. So at the highest level priority, there's going to be the phronetic coordination amongst our various noble vocational goods, our vocational noble goods in our life. And this will also include the vocational others, that is, persons who have become vocational for us. They have become noble goods for us. Second in priority is going to be coordination amongst settled noble goods of one's life and those vocational others, settled noble goods. So I need to give priority and not neglect or allow other goods to crowd out the goods of sustaining a marriage, the goods of sustaining healthy relationships with my children or with my parents. And so I need to coordinate the way in which being a philosopher, being a teacher, being a member of a community, being someone who coaches athletics, someone who plays music with friends. I need to place these settled goods that I just mentioned with respect to my vocational noble goods of my life and the life of my children and my spouse. And I need to find a coordination, and there's a priority to these vocational over these settled, but not in such a way that the vocational excludes ever participating in these settled goods. But it will, insofar as these settled goods come to dominate and push out or crowd out or neglect the vocational ones. So the highest are the vocational, second are these settled. Third are coordinating amongst non-settled noble goods of one's life. Enjoying ancient sculpture is not a settled noble good in my life, and certainly not a vocational one, but it doesn't mean there can't be a place for going to museums and seeing special exhibitions. These are noble goods that are worth pursuing, going and seeing various concerts from time to time, going and watching summer productions of Shakespeare. These aren't settled goods, noble goods of my life, or of others that are vocationally close to me even, but they're nevertheless noble goods, and I should be able to find a place for them in my life, so long as I'm not neglecting or crowding out vocational or settled goods. And then finally, there's also going to be the phronetic coordination amongst non-noble goods. There are plenty of pleasant goods that can have a place in one's life, and of course there's going to be a whole range of instrumental goods that I have to pursue in order to achieve different kinds of noble goods, settled noble goods, and vocational noble goods. So there'll be much more that need to be filled out in this sort of type of decision tree, but also why it's so much different than rational decision theory, how this phronetic conception of practical reasoning and rank ordering of obligations amongst noble goods is structured very differently and has a deep connection and coordination to the kind of natural inclinations, this Aristotelian form of naturalism. All right, just to tie this all up together, some of the criteria that I've laid out for thinking about these noble goods are that they can't be incompatible with the virtues. They're going to partially constitute flourishing. We can't make them the whole of flourishing. That's a mistake. The virtues are actually going to enable us to transform ourselves so that we can pursue these noble goods and that we can coordinate them within our whole life. These noble goods, these Bona Honesta, cannot unjustly exclude other individual or common goods, and they also can't unjustly exclude persons from participating in them. These Bona Honesta are thick concepts. They are, they're each going to have a distinctive ergon function, a finality about them. They're going to include intrinsic goods that are going to provide criteria or standards for their pursuit, execution, fulfillment, how to achieve them. And it is going to require the virtues to transform ourselves to make those and meet those standards, as well as to identify, correct, revise them. And importantly, I think a lot of these noble goods are self-evident, and if not self-evident, at least through minimal reflection on various mutually presupposed terms, we can arrive at an understanding of their place within our lives. It's going to be a lot more difficult to fill out the details, but just the sort of general natural law precepts commanding us to pursue things like health, affiliations, education, leisure, work, it's not going to be difficult to justify or vindicate the truth of those kinds of claims. I want to conclude briefly by setting this schema to work and evaluating a specific case of eudaimonistic need that has gone wrong, that started off and had the potential to be a noble good, fulfilling a eudaimonistic need for leisure, and the ways in which it became distorted and actually came to frustrate the pursuit of flourishing. This is a bit underdeveloped, not sufficiently worked out example, but I hope that it illuminates a little bit of the work that I think in a pretty practical way the schema can be used. So I'm going to choose an example for leisure that among the goods for my adolescent child are noble goods of humane education and leisure. And for our particular family, perhaps it's sports. It might be music, it might be drama, it might be literature, it might be the arts, but I'm going to use an example of sports. And particularly, let's say we're in a community who share a certain specification of noble good of leisure and finding it in sports. Let's say girls softball, but we might have easily chosen American soccer, football, cricket, or any number of other sports. This is a particular kind of practice. It has internal goods as distinct from external goods, but we can pursue both. And pursuing some practice. And it's important to notice that while I'm focusing on it as a case of leisure, it also involves types of education, it involves types of affiliation. It's not unrelated to health and other kinds of eudaimonistic needs. In being a part of a community that prizes competition in girls softball, and being a part of such a community, as parents, we might recognize that softball provides an opportunity for our daughter to learn discipline, to learn it in teamwork and an athletic skill, both types of discipline for learning how to coordinate in activities together for a common goal, how to also, in discipline, transform the way in which one throws a ball, catches a ball, the way in which one sizes up plays or opportunities to throw players out. It also involves the importance of competition and competitiveness as a drive for success and discipline and achievement and teamwork and athletic skill. It provides opportunities for learning virtues of winning and losing well. And it can also provide a lifetime enjoyment of the game, whether as one continues to play as an amateur in local community games, or even just pick-up games with family and friends, or perhaps as a coach at various levels of play later on, perhaps even coaching one's own children, or the enjoyment of teaching one's own children to play the game later in life. Or it might even provide these sorts of lifelong enjoyment independent of any future participation as a player or a coach, just simply enjoying the game, watching it on television, going and attending games without having to participate oneself. So there are a variety of common individual goods that can be learned here within the practice and the leisure enjoyment of participating in a sport. It's also a context in which my daughter and others have various virtues cultivated, and they learn how to follow rules, to respect those rules. But it's also a context that could breed vices. They might learn from each other and be encouraged in various vices that could be sown in this context of pride, of clever ways of cheating, types of egoistic selfishness, types of poor sportsmanship in winning and poor sportsmanship in losing. They might also encounter or become encounter abuse or engage in abuse themselves with respect to their fellow players, or receive it from their coaches or parents. And it might also lead to such levels of engagement that encourage injuries become more and more liable, or it's just always a tragic possibility. So, importantly, we need to see here that leisure can't be taken in isolation, that its own finality as a noble good will have to immediately involve its coordination with other eudaimenistic needs of health, of various types of affiliations, parents and children disagreeing about their participation, ways in which they participate, how much they participate in sport, the child wanting to do it more than the parent willing to allow, the parent encouraging or forcing the child to do it more than the child in fact wants. There will be ways in which it relates to, or is in competition to, kinds of education, and the ways in which it might relate to future work, and the way that it fits within an existential worldview, the worldview of a community that prizes and considers this kind of practice worthwhile, and maybe considers other practices worthwhile, or has perhaps a restricted view and doesn't consider maybe music or the arts as important or as also worthwhile pursuits. And imagine the way that she got into this, similar to McIntyre's example of chess, is that she first had to be introduced by external goods. She didn't initially find softball that interesting. She had to, at an early age, be rewarded by giving her stickers or ice cream or television for being willing to go to practice or practice in the yard. But later, she came to appreciate the internal goods of the sport itself, like the ones I mentioned before. And it turns out that she's both naturally talented and eventually learns, to develop a serious interest in becoming the best. She makes great effort at this. It has become for her, eventually, a developmentally settled noble good. It sets the directionality for the way in which she lives her childhood at the age of 10, into her adolescence, and perhaps even into her young adult life, maybe as a collegiate athlete. So in that respect, it provides an ongoing central end for the directionality of her youth and adolescence, and perhaps longer. And very, very unlikely, for some, it might even for the respect to future work in professional sports. But imagine now that, for various reasons, it no longer becomes the place to foster her pursuit of a noble good, but it starts to become one that crowds out other noble goods. Her participation in the sport, even at an early age, becomes excessive. Maybe due to her own interests, maybe due to pressure from her parents, maybe due to pressure of other parents or peers. But in any case, she goes from the enjoyment of the recreation, practicing once a week, and having games every other week during short periods and seasons, to practicing 3 or 4 nights a week. And not only engaging in club sport versions of the sport of softball, but also being in school versions of softball, sometimes with overlapping seasons, such that she's practicing 2 nights a week for the club team and 2 other nights a week or every night of the week for the school version of the sport. And she's also engaging in this as a very young age, as 9, 10, 11-year-old, traveling very long distances, 10-hour drives to competitions 3 or 4 times a year, or flying to them. And it becomes the case that the sport's practiced all year round, not something that's just seasonal. So the child begins to, in very ways that athletic directors and physical therapists focus on and critique, as that children should be involved in lots of kinds of sports with lots of types of movements. But the excessive focusing on batting or on pitching leads to very restricted kinds of movements from a very early age. And it actually is something that's crowding out concerns for long-term health and even long-term performance and enjoyment in the game. It can lead to lots of early injuries that exclude them from playing the sport in the future. But importantly in this case, it also, this sort of obsessiveness of playing the sport begins to exclude her from other sports. Excludes her from the possibility of participating in music, whether it be in choir or learning an instrument, from partaking in drama club, debate clubs, and most significantly, it begins to crowd out her abilities to engage in academic activity, as well as more casual play and friendships. So it begins to exclude important types of settled goods at this developmental phase, that she needs to be also pursuing academics. She also needs to have casual play and friendships. And it begins to constrain the ends and the noble goods pursued by her parents, but also for her siblings. The siblings now are no longer able to participate in as many other activities, or even any activities, because the talent of the daughter in the game leads it to the parents sacrificing opportunities for themselves, participation in the various noble goods of their community, and also sacrificing their siblings who aren't as spectacular in the sports or who are deprived of opportunities in engaging in musical or dramatic or other kinds of arts and activities. This has become an occasion for vice in the parents, or vice in the daughter, or at least the cultivation, or beginning the cultivation of vice instead of virtues. Children might start developing dispositions of thinking that they should play through injuries no matter what, and that it's important for me or my team, my coach, my parents to keep playing through. So they develop wrong ways of practically reasoning and perceiving and prioritizing, so that health has no longer become a concern because of the obsession with victory or winning, which makes them, of course, more and more vulnerable to early and permanent injuries. And it begins to introduce, and this overall account is an account of a distorting type of existential worldview of how an individual or a family or a community or a team perceives the importance of softball with respect to other noble goods in one's life. And it begins to give a distorting conception of the virtues and the place of rules and what they include or exclude. And it starts or initiates a kind of arrested development. It introduces an arrested development with respect to other eudaimenistic needs. What's gone wrong here is various other eudaimenistic needs have been mistakenly undervalued or devalued. There's a failure in prudence to make the right kind of judgments here, but there's also lacking in justice. They've begun to unjustly exclude other noble goods from their daughter's life, from their own lives, or perhaps other children, and so they have begun to violate some precepts of the natural law. There's also a failure, not just with respect to prudence and justice, but temperance, of not being able to find a moderating place in life. They've developed wrong desires and encouraged them for types of athletic competition and excellence. But they've also misunderstood the developmental temporariness of these sports, that they will only play an important place in life at a very limited stage, and that their participation will eventually be grown out of these sports, and perhaps they've exaggerated the extent to which they will continue to play them, but they've also misunderstood the limited time frame here in which they might need to cultivate their enjoyment of other kinds of goods that could be lifelong goods to be enjoyed. And there's also here a failure of courage. Someone, somewhere along the line, or many someones, have lacked the courage to speak up and take note of the family or the parent or the community or the team's failures in their obsessive pursuit of this particular sport. There's a lot more that could be said, but I've gone on too long. But I hope that's a helpful clarification of some of the ways in which this schema can be used to evaluate very practical cases of misidentified and mispursued what could have been noble goods in one's life and have started to become distractions and impediments to the pursuit of noble goods in a human life. And with that, I thank you very much. I apologize for going about 10 minutes over my time, but I look very much forward to the discussion and conversation.